Hello and welcome. You're watching Sansad Television and I'm Vishal Dahiya. This is our budget special series where we bring you details of what exactly is happening vis-a-vis Indian economy and what is expected from this year's union budget. Now, COVID-19 pandemic has led to considerable human and economic costs during the last 2 years, setting countries back on their developmental goals and economic growth as well. India is no exception, with the GDP contracting by around 7.3% during the previous financial year due to national lockdown forced by COVID-19 onslaught. Now, for the current financial year, however, India's GDP is expected to be 9.2% as per the first advance estimates released by the National Statistical Office, that is NSO. In its December 2021 policy review, RBI had also projected the economy to grow at 9.5%, with the assumption of no resurgence of COVID-19 infections in India. According to Index of Industrial Production, that is IIP, 15 out of 23 sectors are above pre-pandemic levels. However, recent surge of COVID infections due to Omicron variant has come at a time when the economy is finding its way back to growth. The real test of Indian economy will be the ability to resume full-fledged production and the attainment of pre-pandemic levels. In terms of consumption, last year's union budget included various measures to support broad-based and inclusive economic development and increase employment opportunities as well. So what is the present status of Indian economy and what can be expected from this year's budget to give a boost to the overall growth and create more employment opportunities as well? We will discuss and analyze all these aspects and issues in the first episode of our budget special series. And for more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of experts. Let me first introduce them to you. Beginning with, we have with us Mr. Nilesh Shah, who is joining us. He's part-time member of Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, that is EAC. We're also joined by Mr. Ashok Kumar, former Secretary, Ministry of Finance, Government of India, and Ms. Rajani Sheshadri, Chairperson, CII Indian Women Network, Southern Region, is also joining us. We also have with us Mr. Shailesh Pathak, who is the co-chair of Transport Infrastructure at FICCI. Welcome, all of you, to Sansad Television. Let me begin with you, Mr. Shah, and let's start by taking an outlook or sort of a review on where do we stand in terms of our economic growth, various sectors, the way we have been able to go ahead and, bounce back, so as to say, from the pandemic levels.
Look at our economy today in terms of trade, agriculture, private sector investments, and government spending, we are firmly above pre-pandemic level. However, consumption, especially at the bottom of the pyramid and in urban area, continues to remain below pre-pandemic. We are witnessing a K-shaped recovery where we are selling more SUVs than pre-pandemic level, but we are selling less entry-level bikes compared to pre-pandemic level. Today, we have certain strong points in economy, like our FX reserves are $635 billion. We are one of the few countries in the world whose FX reserves are more than their FX liability. Our inflation is well under RBI's target zone. This is one rare period where Indian inflation is lower than American or German inflation.
Okay.
Interest rates are also reasonably supportive for growth policy. Global investors' interest continues to remain in India, as is being witnessed in terms of flows in private equity venture capital space. However, there are certain weak spots, especially related to consumption, and this budget should provide pro-growth, pro-consumption support.
Okay, so the focus has to be on consumption, as Mr. Shah is pointing out. Let me bring in Mr. Ashok Kumar Shah here as well. Mr. Shah, from your perspective, you've been there at the helm of affairs in terms of how we are doing vis-a-vis the pandemic shock which we had. The contraction was around 7.3%. From there onwards, it was obviously an uphill task. But as Mr. Shah is pointing out, we've done pretty well.
Well, I think, as Mr. Shah mentioned, the recovery has been very uneven. The rich have got richer, and the evidence of that is very clear. If you look at various indicators, for instance, the high-end car sales have shot up even though generally the car sales have come down. The listed companies, their profitability has gone up. And if you look at the other side of the coin, the poor have got poorer. You have, for instance, as Mr. Shah also mentioned, there is a decline in the sales of two-wheelers. The demand for Manrega has gone up appreciably in the last few months, which really indicates that job opportunities are not adequate in the rural economy. So I think all in all, the recovery has been there, but I won't go into the semantics of whether it is a K-shaped recovery or a V-shaped recovery. But I think it is fair to say that the recovery has been entirely uneven. The way out of this really is to increase aggregate demand, put more money into the hands of people who will use the money to boost demand, whether it is for two-wheelers or whether it is for other goods of consumption. So I would expect that this budget should tackle that to increase aggregate demand amongst the poorest of the poor, so that they can in turn build up the demand levels in the economy. Because unless that is done, the question of investment in the economy is going to be very doubtful, because nobody is going to invest unless there is adequate demand in the economy.
Okay, fair enough. That is also a really important aspect there, as both of you are pointing out. Consumption and employment opportunities are closely intertwined, and more spurt in the consumption will obviously lead to economic growth as well. Let's look at the industry's perspective also in terms of where do we stand. We have with us both Ms. Sheshadri here and Mr. Pathak also. Let me begin with you, Ms. Sheshadri. From your point of view, how are we doing? Obviously, the IIP index in terms of various sectors or various formats of numbers we are looking at, it looks like most of those figures are in favor. But on the ground, how does it look?
I come from the services sector, so let me talk about that. I lead the manufacturing sector to Mr. Pathak.
Indeed.
In the services sector, there's a huge demand. But these are for what we call skills of the future. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, analytics, accounting in different forms, finance in different forms, managing people of a very wide range, starting from youngsters who graduated during COVID all the way to people who are well into their careers. So, but there is a huge demand, and these are for skills of the future. Our upskilling is lagging behind. And we have to figure out how we can make that more accessible, how we can make it more attractive for companies to invest in upskilling so that they build up the kind of expertise that they need within their own businesses, and also to encourage youngsters who have whose curriculum has not been focused on those areas. How do you help them to build their skills so that they are ready for the jobs of the future? I run a company that helps bring professional women who've taken a career break back to work. Upskilling is just as important for them, because if we leave 50% of our population out of the workforce, then our GDP is going to be constrained from that point of view. So how do we make these skills available, the skills of the future available to people, so that they can bring in the kind of expertise that there is a demand for today?
Okay. So services sector obviously is really important, and there the aspect of upskilling, as Mr. Sheshadri is pointing out. Mr. Shailesh, Pathak, when we're looking at the manufacturing sector, the numbers seems to be, giving us a sense of pleasure in the past few months. But going from here onwards, how do you see things moving ahead?
Vishalji, I'd like to talk about three specific points. But partly what has happened in the last 12, 18 months, and partly what has happened in the last 5 to 10 years. So let me begin with a story.
Okay.
I was in Hangzhou in 2016 October because of the G20, and while returning from Shanghai, I took a guided tour, and our tour guide was this 24-year-old lady who said that she does not come out of home with anything except a mobile phone, which is used for everything from ordering to booking, everything. And in October 2016, I was wondering when India would get there. And we have a situation today where our payments digital are roughly double of what our northern neighbors' payments are. So how quickly things change is an example. The second point is two hard data numbers. One is GST collections and the other is toll collections, which also captures the informal sector.
Okay.
And as we know, both GST as well as toll collections are well back to the pre-pandemic levels. The last point I have is on infrastructure. And in the last 16 months, we've had 4 N's: the National Infrastructure Pipeline, the National Monetization Pipeline, the National Bank for Financing Infrastructure and Development, NAFID, and the NPMPF, the National Program and Project Management Framework. I would see a continuation of what Finance Minister did in her last budget, which was a very good budget for industry. And specifically on 3 things, we would like to see some action. The 3 C's. I'd say coordination, I'd say capacity, and I'd say contractual resolutions. So coordination like the PM Gati Shakti mission, can we have similar coordination at the state level and the city level? Capacity building, especially of the public sector and its officials, is being taken up by Mission Karmyogi. And lastly, contracts. How do we get our contracts enforced? How do we get dispute resolution sorted out? That is the challenge. Thank you.
Okay. So those 3 C's are going to be really important there. We'll come back to those 3 C's as well. But first focusing on the other aspect, that is employment opportunities or job creation. Mr. Shah, you earlier mentioning the consumption part and how we need to bring that to the pre-pandemic levels as well for overall growth, growth figures to go up. And consumption is closely intertwined with employment opportunities as well. Upskilling in service sector is obviously a very integral, important part there also. So vis-a-vis employment opportunities, how do you see in terms of the place where we stand right now, the situation we are in, and what we need to do?
Again, there is a lot of unevenness in employment. On one side, we have startups who are offering BMW bike to get the talent. On other side, PhDs are applying for government PUM jobs. There is a huge diversity among the employment seekers. And clearly, we have no option but to use all tools possible to create employment. Now, 2 large industries in India are automobile and housing. In automobile, there is limited thing which we can do at this point of time because of raw material shortages. But housing can have a multiplier effect. It has lowest amount of import dependency. And in last 10 years, housing has taken away every year 1% of incremental GDP growth. Overall, housing slowdown has costed India about 10% of GDP.
Okay.
Now stars are aligned for housing sector. Interest rate on housing loans are low. Work from home has created demand for housing. Affordability of housing for certain sectors of economy has improved. Now, if we can provide tax incentives, which have remained constant since 2014, for interest on housing loan and housing loan prepayment, maybe taxpayers will be left with some money and that money will be spent. So we'll have 2 birds with 1 stone. Housing sector gets supported and consumption gets supported. A stamp duty cut is a surefire way to increase housing demand. We have seen in the state of Maharashtra, when government gives stamp duty cuts, it preponed demand for housing. The third thing could be giving incentives for buying of certain kind of houses up to certain limit. Again, like US using Freddie Mae, Fannie Mae, Ginnie Mae created housing for all Americans. Time has come for India to create housing for every Indian. If we can push housing sector, I'm sure it will create enough jobs at the bottom of the pyramid. And then this whole virtuous cycle begins, where people have more jobs, they consume more, that creates more investment, that in turn will create more jobs. one final point in this budget which we should focus upon is reskilling. I mean, this is the world where we'll have to learn, relearn, forget and relearn. How do we ensure that people are skilled for the jobs for which there is demand? This transition of people from, let's say, and I'm just calling it for a generic purpose, from agriculture to services, agriculture to manufacturing, that's something which we should focus upon in this budget.
Okay. Okay. So those obviously are going to be key aspects which we will have to watch out for. Mr. Jha, do you concur with what Mr. Shah is saying in terms of areas or steps which need to be in focus to not only give a sort of a boost to the growth trajectory, but also those specific aspects which will in turn eventually lead to higher growth. That is consumption, one, and two, employment opportunities. Create more and more of them.
Yeah, there is no doubt whatsoever that we have to focus on employment generation. Now, whether the employment generation is through the increase in construction activity, or it is in the case of, say, textiles, which has very large percentage of people who are employed in that sector, or gems and jewelry, or leather and leather products. These are all employment-intensive industries. See, because we have to really be concerned about the fact that the labor participation rates in this country have fallen, and have fallen abysmally. In fact, our labor participation rates, especially of women, is below some of our own neighboring countries in South Asia. So we have to really focus on this. It was expected that, when China started vacating the sphere of textiles and garments, that India would become a key player. But we have not become a key player. It's the countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, etc., that have taken the space vacated by China. So we really have to focus on those sectors which have greater potential for employment generation. Otherwise, if say 50% of our labor force, women, are either denied employment or they do not seek employment for various reasons, then there is a real cause for worry. In addition to that, what I would like to mention really is that, the budget by itself is not such a fantastic event, in the sense that the budget is roughly 12 to 14% of the GDP. That's the total expenditure out of the budget. But of course, the budget does indicate lines of action for the future, both in the short term as well as the medium term. So from that point of view, it is important. But in terms of the outlays, as I said, it is 12 to 14% of GDP. And the overall outlays for each sector, therefore, get determined by that, by that overall quantum. And if we take just four items of budgeted expenditure, that is interest payments, defense expenditure, expenditure on subsidies, pensions, just these four items account for more than 50% of the total budget outlay. So the levels of freedom available to the finance minister to tweak the expenditure towards favorable channels is very, very limited. But what the budget can do is to essentially tweak the policies so that more investment can flow into these sectors which are employment intensive sectors.
Okay. So more money required for employment intensive sectors, which in turn will give a boost to the consumption and further fuel the economic growth as well. Mr. Sheshadri, you were earlier mentioning about how upskilling is really important. Mr. Shah also referred to the reskilling part. Now, vis-a-vis the services sector, and when we are looking at the employment generation part, what is it that is required from your perspective, from the industry's perspective? What kind of support or what kind of policy tweaks, changes are you looking forward to?
I'll take an example. It's too vast a subject for me to just generalize. As an example, one of the key skills of the future is going to be dealing with data. How do companies use the data that they have gathered about customers, about markets, about products, all of that? One of the skills, in order to deal with data, you need to have data engineers, and business analysts and data, the people who build the tools for analytics. All of these are new skills. They're also skills of the future in that they are not going to become obsolete within the next at least 10 years. So now how do we help people to acquire these skills? These are not part of the regular curriculum of any undergraduate program today. They're also not part of the skill set of people who left the workforce, let's say 5, 10 years ago. So how do we make them come up to speed? What are these tools? How do these algorithms work? How is it implemented? How can it make a difference to the business of a company which is using this as one skill? So in order for us to have enough data engineer, enough data analysts, enough business analysts, there has to be a huge upskilling program. And given that this is only one out of the 50 skills that are considered to be skills of the future, there is a huge amount of work that can come out of not only the industry of learning, but because of the people who are trained and who learn these new skills being deployed in companies, in jobs, people are begging for these skills. We don't have enough people who are qualified, who have these skills to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. So we need to encourage upskilling. We need to encourage awareness among people that these are the skills of the future. So please find a way find something that interests you that you can become expert in. And if we can offer incentives to companies, let's say if you hire people, if you add so much to employment, and therefore these are the incentives, much like we have the PLI, right? If we could create incentives for companies to hire people, especially people from rural areas, women who've taken a career break, all of that, we would encourage a lot more of the right skill for the jobs that are available.
Okay. Indeed, those are very, very important, aspects when we're talking about upskilling or reskilling there. Data, obviously, all of us know is being considered as the new gold or new oil. And the way we need to deal with the data would require a lot of skills. Why not our people, and specifically from rural areas, and women, as Ms. Sheshadri is pointing out, are able to go ahead and take a benefit of that situation out there. But that would again require a lot of focus on skilling, reskilling, and upskilling as well. Mr. Pathak, I'd like to bring you in here. And when we talk about employment opportunities, industry has a very big role to play. Of course, government on its own cannot provide employment opportunities to such a vast segment of population which is seeking jobs or employment opportunities. And MSMEs specifically do play a very important role. Now, if you have to understand what is the situation there and what is required to give that push, much required push to creation of employment opportunities in the industry sector.
Thank you, Vishalji, for mentioning MSMEs, because most of FICCI's membership is not from large-scale industry, but from a lot of micro, small and medium enterprises. And let me say also that most large companies are not islands unto themselves. We all have vendors and subcontractors and small suppliers who are all from the MSME sector. And as you very rightly said, most employment is not even going to be in the large corporate sector, it is going to be in the MSME sector. So what can be done? And to my mind, three things are already happening. The first that I am very impressed with is the e-Shram initiative of the Ministry of Employment and Labour. The last 100 days, more than 20 crore informal workers have registered and got a universal account number. So the trend is, informal workers are getting formalized, which is going to solve a lot of problems for both the workers and the potential employers. The second is that MSMEs and the compliance burden of MSMEs is going down, particularly with GST. And GST is also going to have a ranking system. So there's a virtuous cycle to get a better ranking, and so that the MSME can grow and employ more people. But the most crucial thing, as earlier panelists have mentioned, is a skill mismatch. So our challenge in our country today is largely, too many people in agriculture can move to manufacturing and services. And typically when they move, they are unskilled. And the industry that can absorb the maximum number of unskilled labor is construction. So a lot of thought is required on how to get labor, unskilled labor easily into construction. And, real estate was mentioned, housing was mentioned. We actually need a construction boom in our country in the next 5 years. And I hope infrastructure was one of the pillars mentioned by the finance minister in last year's speech. I hope construction and the labor employment potential of construction gets special attention.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So the labor employment potential is one of the key focus areas, as Mr. Pathak is pointing out. Now, Mr. Shah, you earlier mentioned the housing sector as well. That takes care of one of the parts or one of the points which is being mentioned by Mr. Pathak. But the other points which have been, raised by both Mr. Pathak and Mr. Sheshadri out there in terms of not only generation of employment, but also, as I was saying earlier, that the same leads to a cycle which then eventually ends up in more, robust economic growth out there.
Undoubtedly, we really don't have a choice of firing just one bullet. We have to keep on firing all the bullets at all the time. And on the manufacturing side, we now seem to have got some winning formula through PMP, which is Phased Manufacturing Program, Production Linked Incentive Scheme, and 100% FTI. About a couple of years back, we were importing $8 billion worth of mobile phones. We were the second largest consumer of mobile phones in the world, but there were hardly any factories making mobile phones in India. The government came out with 100% FTI, Phased Manufacturing Program, Production Linked Incentive Scheme, electronic and electrical manufacturing clusters, and a couple of other steps. Fast forward to 2021, our mobile manufacturing value has grown 8 times to 220,000 crore in FY21. From being net importer of $8 billion worth of mobile phones, we will be exporting close to $4 billion worth of mobile phones this year. And with the production-linked incentive schemes coming into full formalization, we have seen Apple's, all the three main producers, by Foxconn, Winstron, and Pegatron, setting up their base in India. We are now no longer assembling mobile phones, but we have components makers setting up their shops in India, from glass panel to plastic and rubber components to motors. Today, our market share in global mobile handsets is at lower end and about 5%. If this PLI does get executed on ground, we should be having about 15% market share. This is the way for us to go forward in every other sector possible. Textiles, automobile, auto components, soft toys, APIs and bulk drugs, solar panels. In every sector, we need this kind of focused approach where all the obstacles of entrepreneurs are removed. We create jobs, we bring investments, we become exporter, and we leverage our domestic market for becoming part of global supply chain management.
Okay.
This then creates the virtuous cycle of more jobs, more investments, more growth, and more demand.
Okay, okay. It is indeed a cycle out there which we will have to focus on, and various aspects as well. And you're right there, Mr. Shah, when you point out that just firing one bullet will not be sufficient. Mr. Shah, your views there on the suggestions coming in from the industry and the services sector. And the question is, how much of it is practically possible to implement in the short term? Because we're looking at the short term here as well, next financial year, to give that push to the economic growth.
Well, I think at the outset, I would like to say that I have a slightly different take than Mr. Shah on how to boost manufacturing in the country.
Okay.
I do not think that the way we are going about it today is really going to, in the medium term even, going to increase our exports or increase the manufacturing activity in the country. Because, see, what we have done over the last few years, unfortunately, has been that we have kept on increasing our tariff rates, with the result that what had been started post 1991 which was to progressively reduce tariff rates so that we become competitive internationally, we have now reversed the process. Now, this, in my view, is going to be counterproductive because today most of the trade globally takes place through this global value chains, which means that one component is made in one country, another component in another country gets assembled in a third country, gets exported out of a fourth country.
Okay.
So this kind of flexibility for movement of inputs is going to get badly affected with our increase in custom duties. In a short term, after all, you see, we must remember that for about 70 years, we tried this creating Indian market as a protected market. And the result was there for all of us to see that we became inefficient in almost every single product that we made in this country. So I don't think that is the right approach. The right approach would really be to make Indian industry competitive so that it can stand on its own feet and it can then compete with the rest of the world on an equal footing.
Okay.
So that's one issue that I would like to highlight. The other is that, we often look at the issue of the budget and we say that, there's not enough money with the government, so what can they do? They don't have enough resources. I think the solution is to raise resources in a more dynamic fashion. And by raising resources, I don't necessarily mean that we tax the people more. Because as it is, I think a few people in this country bear the burden of taxes to the maximum extent. There are a lot of assets owned by the government. And I'm not talking of public sector undertakings, which have already, there is a disinvestment process which is going on. But I'm talking of assets which are just lying without being utilized. Say the land that is owned by the government. The railways and the defense for the ministry own huge tracts of land. Now, I'm not suggesting that we sell them because in this country, if you try selling them, immediately the criticism will be that we are selling off family silver. But we can definitely monetize them by leasing them out for productive activity, and that will get revenue for the country.
Okay.
And the budgetary process can be therefore further enhanced.
Okay, indeed, those are fair suggestions, which is we're looking at various avenues or various options through which we can give that much required boost, bring that much required investment or money as well. Let's quickly, bring in both the industry representatives here as well. Mr. Pathak, I'd like to start with you. In terms of your response to what Mr. Jha and Mr. Shah are saying, measures need to be taken both short-term and long-term. How do you think this will help the overall economic growth and, of course, the industry sectors as well?
Thank you. World Bank studies are very clear. The two factors that lead to economic growth directly are good education and good infrastructure. And this is across the globe. We have nearly doubled our outlays on infrastructure in the last 6 years. Now, we would like to see more, of course, in education. But let me say that the budget is an income and expenditure statement and nothing more. The overall economic policy of the government is fairly clear over the last 5 to 10 years. And therefore, the budget is implementing the long-term fiscal management policy. The fact is that government resources and government revenues are really increasing. And tax revenues, we never thought would be so high, both indirect and direct.
Okay.
Can we get more return on investment of government expenditure? And can we rationalize a few schemes? Just to give you an example, in education, instead of budgets going directly to schools, now we have something called e-Rupee, which is nothing more than a voucher, which is a single-use focused objective. Can we start giving e-Rupee vouchers for education to every parent? And the parent can decide which school to send her child to.
Okay.
So things like this can really enhance the productivity of expenditure.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So that obviously is another key aspect which Mr. Pathak is pointing out in terms of more return on government investment in the expenditures which it makes. Mr. Sheshadri, a quick concluding comment from you. Vis-a-vis these suggestions which are coming in, and when we are looking at both short-term and long-term implications on all aspects, which ultimately lead to that target which all of us are talking about, that is higher growth.
See, I like Mr. Pathak's suggestion on the e-voucher, the voucher that goes to parents. I also think that one of the things that we need to do is emphasizing career intentionality in women and girls. And towards that, whatever policies need to come in, they may not be budget, but they might be intentions in the budget. But those are all going to be long term. Mm-hmm. The short term ones are going to be the skill building, incentivizing companies to hire women, all of that. But the long term ones are really what can we do to make sure that our environment facilitates employment of women.
Okay.
So that they don't have to give up their earning potential, their income potential, just because of family priorities.
Okay.
Can we make the infrastructure so robust that we have bandwidth that never fails? Can we incentivize companies, and can we change our thinking to say work from anywhere, right?
Okay.
Which means electricity also has to be uninterrupted. Electricity, bandwidth, okay, a change in our mindset. All of those, I don't really know if those are budget as much as policy and intention. And one of the ways to make policy, one of the ways to create intentions, to change mindsets, is by providing incentives.
Indeed.
So we come back to the budget.
Indeed, budget is all about the money which is being spent in various places, but it's all about the long-term policy initiatives as well, reform measures which have already been put in place also. And as all of you are pointing out, it is when we're looking at the focus on higher growth, then it has to be all about generating more employment opportunities and, of course, giving a push to consumption and maintaining or rather improving our rate of growth in production and manufacturing sector as well, and services also. Some very interesting and important suggestions coming in there from you. Thank you so much, Ms. Rajani Sheshadri, as well as Mr. Ashok Kumar Shah and Mr. Nilesh Shah and Mr. Shailesh Pathak as well for sharing your views and insight with us. And now we're also joined by another special guest. We'll try and understand from him as well. Mr. Arvind Panagariya is also joining us, Professor of Economics at Columbia University and former Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog as well. Welcome to Sansad TV, Professor Panagariya. What we're talking about here is the focus on growth and employment opportunities when we are looking at what exactly is to be expected from the union budget. Now, let's take it one by one. I'm pretty sure you will have clear views on both aspects, but let's start with the growth prospects and the journey which we have had in the past year and a half or 2 years almost, trying to recover from that pandemic shock. The clear idea or the clear focus is to get back to pre-pandemic levels and then sail from there onwards. How have we done so far in the past 1.5 to 2 years to try and recover from that pandemic shock?
So my own view is that we have handled the pandemic quite well, as well as any other country has. I think, we did not go overboard initially when the pandemic hit in terms of subsidies and transfers. We did exactly the right thing we should have done, which was to provide food to everybody, to provide shelter to everybody. And then from as the pandemic kind of unfolded, we also went into structural reforms. And above all, I think the most important thing that was to be done, which we have done with great success, is vaccination. With 1.5 billion jabs within a democratic framework, I think this is absolutely remarkable. So I think we did good work through these 2 years. Growth has suffered, but it has suffered everywhere. But we are recovering well also. So, the latest figures that have come out on the GDP for these are the advanced estimates for the 21-22 GDP. They already placed the economy overall in GDP terms at the pre-pandemic level. Okay. So we have returned to the pre-pandemic level.
Okay. Now, Professor Panagariya, you mentioned those numbers there. The NSO says around 9.3%. The RBI earlier in December, in its policy review, said around 9.5%. But then there was a rider as well that there are no further rise in infections, the COVID infections. Now we've seen Omicron variant, making waves, and of course, just like the rest of the world, India is also trying to tackle that. How would that might affect the year-long scenario or the final figures?
Yeah. So look, this I have maintained throughout the last 2 years since the pandemic first hit that recovery, how the economy performs, ultimately depends on how the virus evolves, and it is a very, very unpredictable virus. So I don't even dare kind of make guesses. You remember, most of our experts were saying that there was going to be a third wave in October, November. That did not happen, but it is now happening. So this is an unpredictable virus. So anything we say in terms of what are the future prospects is contingent on how the virus behaves. But if the virus behaves and we are able to keep our economy open without having to resort to lockdowns, whether mild or severe, then I think prospects are excellent. Okay. Then we would grow in the post-pandemic period easily for 7 to 8% per year. For at least 1 to 2 decades.
Okay. There you're right, Professor Panagariya, that this is a wily opponent when we're talking about the COVID pandemic, but we're tackling it, with all the efforts which we can put on place here. And the vaccination part is clearly playing a very significant role, as you mentioned earlier also. Now let's look at what is it that we have done well. What is it that requires a little bit more push in terms of various sectors? When we look at the IIP data, manufacturing, the MSMEs, production, there's been a lot of thirst in the past 3 to 4 months after the lockdown was lifted. It started moving slowly, and it is now gaining that momentum as well. But in terms of consumption, and the experts also say, Mr. Shah was earlier referring to Mr. Jha also, that in terms of consumption, we need to give a further push.
Well, look, I know that in India somehow the short-term macroeconomics seems to dominate the discourse, and that always kind of zeroes in on consumption or government expenditure, meaning on the demand side. I really think that this pandemic is not just a demand side phenomenon; it is much more a supply side phenomenon.
Indeed,
and that's where we ought to be focusing. So that's the first part. But still, we need to address the demand side as well. On that, I would personally actually pitch for capital expenditures by the government. I think that is one thing that the government can do well. The second, on the private side, I would focus very, very much on the financial sector, meaning that the credit growth. It is the credit growth which has taken a big hit, and that there initially we suffered from the NPAs of the banking sector. Then there was the NBFC crisis. Mm-hmm. All of that, and particularly the NBFC crisis, immediately hits the consumer credit because a lot of the, those who are buying trucks, those who are buying automobiles, etc., a lot of that lending is done by the NBFCs. So that is a sector on which to focus, revive that sector. That is how we are going to revive, the private demand. Okay. Private consumption. It is, by the way, coming up. I mean, it's not as though, we keep saying that private consumption is not picking up. That's not true, actually, if you look at the data. Private consumption has picked up during 21-22 relative to 2021. The data are very clear, actually, on that. We still, on private demand, have not reached the level that we had in 2019-20. So pre-pandemic, I think private demand still to go. But at the same time, let me return and say that on supply side, and by the way, the growth figures across the sectors now for 21-22 are quite excellent. Agriculture 3.9%, almost 4%. Manufacturing 12.5%. Electricity 8.5%. Construction 10.7%. Even hotel, transportation, communication, which are very badly hit by the pandemic, 11.9%. So across the board, the economy is recovering very well. Admittedly, it is on a low base, but nevertheless, we still had to deal with it during this particular fiscal year with the second wave, and now towards the last quarter of it, we are having to deal with the third wave.
Indeed.
So in spite of all that, overall, 9.2% growth is what the advanced estimates puts at. Which is remarkable. So I won't be so pessimistic.
Okay. And that recovery which we're talking about, obviously coming from the contraction of 7.3% to that growth rate of around 9%, which all the agencies are or analysts are pointing to, would obviously be remarkable. Now, you mentioned certain aspects in terms of what needs to be done, more government spending as well. How will that help? In another very important aspect, when we are looking at the overall, a growth trajectory, obviously it has various elements. One of the key significant elements is the employment scenario, the job scenario, the employment opportunities there as well. Many experts believe that a lot more needs to be done to give a push to create more employment opportunities. Obviously, all of that cannot be done by the government. The industry, the private sector will also have to pitch in, but that would also need a lending hand or helping hand from the government.
Well, again, I really think that we expect too much from the government. It's not government's job. Government's job is to provide good policies. Ultimately, it's the private sector which has to create the bulk of the jobs. This thinking which always focuses on what the government can do. Government, tell the government what are the good policies. And I think of that, the government has done quite a bit. I would point to 4 very big reforms that have been done: the insolvency bankruptcy code, the labor law reforms, the corporate profit tax, which is now globally competitive, and labor law reforms. So 4 mutually reinforcing big reforms, fantastic progress on infrastructure, digitization. So those, 6 things roughly, mutually reinforcing, very important. They are going to help. Now, our problem, of course, is the one of gross underemployment. We keep saying unemployment, but in a developing economy, unemployment is never very high. If you look at the unemployment rate was 6% pre-pandemic, it's about 6% post-pandemic. It is underemployment, that which basically means that very low productivity employment. And for that, at the high end, of course, you are doing extremely well. If you look at all the reports that are coming, job offers on campuses, Indeed. Fantastic, at least in the tech sector. And the turnover rate is, my friends in the tech industry tell me about 25%, that every year they're losing 25% of their workers. That's telling you, and it's not because they're firing them, but it's quite the opposite, that they are leaving. So that tells me enormous pressure, actually, at least at the high end. Now, at the low end, I've always maintained that labor-intensive industries have never done very well in India. That is what the government policies ought to focus on. There, the states have to do their bit because the central labor laws have been reformed quite well. It's the states which should take the initiative. The states can now give the full rights to the, regardless of the size of the firm. The central law says 300 workers or fewer, then you have the right to hire or fire. But the states, through purely a notification, can change that and raise that limit to whatever they want.
Okay.
So states like Gujarat, Uttar Pradesh, they should be now pitching in. Maharashtra, they should really do the rest of the reform on the labor laws and help the labor-intensive industry grow. I think that's where the big jobs are, which means apparel, clothing industry, footwear, furniture, a lot of the light manufacturing kinds of products that China, exported in droves in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Same is being done by Vietnam today. Even Bangladesh is doing very well in these labor-intensive exports. Unless we conquer the global markets in a few of these highly labor-intensive products, you're not going to solve the employment problem.
Okay.
And that's where both the state and the center have to provide the proper policy framework. The center has done a good bit of its work. States need to do theirs now.
Indeed, states will have to pitch in there. You're right, Professor Panagariya. But when we're talking about the labor-intensive sector, another view is that perhaps a bit more spending or a bit more push when we're talking about the infrastructure sector or the real estate. That is one part. And the other end, which you're referring to, the higher end or the middle end, the upskilling or the reskilling part there, newer technologies, newer avenues which are there. Obviously, people will need to be reskilled, upskilled, and trained further so that those opportunities can be availed by them in terms of, jobs or employment avenues.
Yeah, no, I still believe that that skilling and reskilling, that also should be done by the enterprises themselves. Because to expect that the government can predict which skills will be needed and which skills will not be needed is a little too much. If the government could do it, we had the Planning Commission doing it for more than 50 years. It would have done it. It didn't happen. So change the strategy. Again, facilitating legislation is very important. So their Apprenticeship Act should be looked at again. I think some reforms were done by the Modi government in its early years.
Okay.
Maybe more needs to be done, but make it attractive for the enterprises themselves to skill and reskill their workers. And that is how I proceed. Even if you're going to spend money, the government money, which is really the taxpayer money, the government doesn't have money, it takes from the taxpayer. If taxpayer money is to be spent, I would still say, give this to the firms. Maybe for first 2 years, the wages up to 10% or 15% can be covered by that, by some sort of subsidy.
Okay.
But I'm not a big fan of subsidies, I must say. But if the government insists on spending money on skilling, that is how it should do it.
Okay.
This way, the skills that are in demand, that firms need, are the ones that get created. And then we have to change, of course, our longer term solution lies into incorporating skill formation in the curriculums.
Okay.
We have tried to separate these two things, the ITIs, etc., separately for skill formation, and for academic education, we do other institutions.
Okay.
I think some of this should be actually incorporated, allow students to study and acquire skills while they are doing their high school and their higher secondary diplomas. Even in colleges, actually, provide for the courses that are going to give some vocational kind of skills.
Okay.
Not everybody will want them, not everybody will go for them, but many will. And this will also destigmatize. You see, when you go to ITI or something, there's a bit of stigma test, so people are hesitant to go. But if you have these things going on in the regular curriculum, then that stigma is not attached.
Okay.
And people will, even those who are doing academic education will acquire some skills, how to fix automobiles, how to fix your own electricity connections, etc. at home. Those are good skills to have for lifelong.
Okay.
So I think that's the way to go about skilling in my view.
Okay. Indeed, that is a really, really important and significant aspect there. Professor Panagariya, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your views in terms of what actually needs to be done when we're talking about the overall economic growth and specifically increasing the employment opportunities or the job scenario there, as well as Professor Panagariya was pointing out and our earlier guests were also referring to. Of course, it cannot be expected just from the government when we're talking about employment opportunities. There are policies which the government will have to make and tweak from time to time to benefit the other stakeholders as well. But the other stakeholders here, in specifically the private industry and the state governments, also will have to pitch in terms of aligning their own policies and their steps as well to try and achieve that goal of a full recovery and moving ahead further on the path of economic growth. We'll come back again in the next episode of this budget special series and focus on another aspect of what needs to be done and what can be expected in the union budget. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.